Hello, I'm Freeman Hrabowski, president of UMBC. I'm delighted to have as my guest today Manil Suri, professor of mathematics here at the university and an international novelist. Welcome.
Thank you.
You know, it's interesting that I've thought of you for decades now as my colleague in mathematics. But in the past decade or so, all of a sudden you've become this world-renowned novelist, this international figure in fiction. And I suppose the big question is, in light of your success, having had books now translated into 25 languages, and especially in light of this new book, The Age of Shiva, as a #1 bestseller in India, and the great success of The Death of Vishnu, the real question is, how did you get into writing? How did you become this international novelist? Since, as a fellow mathematician, I'm always excited about what you do in mathematics. So explain to us this evolution, if you would.
Well, I think when I first joined UMBC, which incidentally is the only job I've ever had, and this was 25, 26 years ago, I realized that I needed something else besides mathematics. I think in today's world, you're really almost shoehorned into one corner, and you're asked to do just one thing. And so it was really a diversion, a hobby, that made me start writing. And I think it became more serious over the years. Like, I took many years before I actually got to anywhere close to even thinking about sending something for publication, like short stories. And I did do that, and I got about 60, 70 rejections. Everything got rejected. And so it was really luck that also plays a role, because there's a lot of good writing out there, but I somehow seem to have struck the right note at the right time, where Indian fiction was really in the news and coming up. And so a book that I wrote, my first novel, it actually got published, and it got...
Go back, though, please.
Okay.
You got all those rejections.
Right.
You must have received some encouragement, and I'm thinking about young writers as they get those letters of encouragement or those letters of rejection. At what point did you begin to get the encouragement? What kept you going if you were getting so many letters of rejection?
I think what kept me going was the fact that I wasn't trying to get published for many years. And this only happened, I only started sending stuff out after I'd started The Death of Vishnu, and I was completely blocked. I had this writer's block, and I said, okay, let me try to publish something, and that'll give me the encouragement. And it didn't, because I got rejections. But luckily, I had a colleague, a friend actually, who teaches at American University, Richard McCann, and he said he made some good suggestions. One of the things he suggested was to take a writing course with a very well-known author. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner, Michael Cunningham, who was giving this one-week workshop in a place called Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown. And he's the one who really, he looked at the first 3 chapters of The Death of Vishnu, and he said something to the effect that, okay, you've got to quit your job and just do this. Well, I didn't follow his advice. I'm still a professor.
We are very pleased that you didn't.
Yes. But that really, you know, if a Pulitzer Prize winner says that, okay, maybe he has a point somewhere.
That's amazing. And the Age of Shiva has done so well, as has The Death of Vishnu. Let's talk about The Age of Shiva. Somehow there is something about your own personal life that's interwoven into that book. Talk about how you developed it. Talk about the trilogy itself and where this fits in your thinking.
Yeah, I think when I started writing The Death of Vishnu, the first book, and also in The Age of Shiva, I feel that I have a charge that is to explain India in some sense, or to represent India, not explain it, but just represent it. And India, as you know, is just such a vast country. It has so much diversity. I mean, people talk about diversity here, but go to India and you'll see people discriminate against each other regularly on the basis of, you know, anything you can think of: language, caste, religion, whatever. And if you've ever looked at Indian photographers, like Raghubir Singh comes to mind, you'll see that his photographs have a lot of stuff going on, and there are multiple points of view. And so this is one of the challenges that I found very interesting in both the Age of The Death of Vishnu first, and then the Age of Shiva. I mean, when I look at my own life, the place that I grew up, you know, all of that had to come into the first book. When I started the second book, I'd used up everything I knew. That's what happens typically with authors. They use up everything in their first book, and then they have nothing to go on. So like any good author, I decided to plunder, if you will, the lives of my parents. And I started looking at where they came from. I'd grown up with stories about the partition of India into India and Pakistan, which happened on August 15th, 1947. Well, my parents were married on July 10th, 1947. And so they couldn't even open their wedding presents. They just had to flee. And they came to Delhi, and then eventually my father moved to Bombay. And this was always, I thought, great material. It would be great, I thought, to have a story with characters who made a similar trek. And that's what sort of provided the seed. When I actually started writing stuff about the partition, I suddenly realized, okay, their story isn't that interesting, and I need to just go away from that, just use that as a seed, and then maybe even change the setting, maybe change the time setting. So instead of the partition, 1947, I started looking at 1955, where India was a very young country and very male-dominated, but there was a lot of new ideas springing up. And so instead of the story of this couple making this trek, became a story of a woman making a similar journey, an odyssey, if you will, in a very male-dominated world.
And you talk about a culture and a country where you have not lived for years. It's very interesting. Talk about your own background and your movement to college here, and how writing as someone, in some ways, in two worlds, between two worlds, has to do research, has to think through how people think differently.
Yeah, it's amazing. I left India when I was 20, and of course I go back pretty often. I go back 2 or 3 times a year, so I'm always connected. But you're right, I haven't lived there for a long time. And yet I find that when it comes to fiction especially, when it comes to characters, what I'm always drawn towards are somehow Indian characters and Indian settings. I was writing something for the next book, the third one. I wrote some parts that were set in Pittsburgh because that's where I spent some time. And then last summer I said, these characters would work so much better in India. So now I'm just revising the whole thing and setting it all in India. So there's something about India, about your formative experiences perhaps, that just keeps drawing you back. I mean, they're just so strong, and the sights and sounds and smells, if you will, they're just stuck in my memory, and so that always comes out. But beyond that, I think what happens in India is that anything can happen. There's just so many things going on, so many variables that you can, as an author, you can sort of twist them around or use them or set them in different interesting combinations and make almost anything believable. So the constraints that you're working with are somehow different than I would have in this culture.
Mm-hmm. Talk about the notion of a trilogy. Everybody knows you're writing 3 books,
right,
The Death of Vishnu, The Age of Shiva, and now the third that you're talking about. Talk about that in relationship to the research you're doing and have had to do in having such a deep understanding of issues involving religion and culture.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The first book, The Death of Vishnu, it started as a short story. And I'd gone to India, and there was this man named Vishnu who lived in my building, and he lived on the steps, basically. He was very sick, and he actually died while I was there. And I decided, I should write something it was a very sordid death, an unsung death, to make it a little more meaningful. So that's why I started the story. And I was taking a writing workshop, and the instructor said, if you're going to talk about a man named Vishnu, if you have a character named Vishnu, people are going to think about the Hindu god Vishnu. And I felt like protesting. I said, well, half the people in India are named after some god or the other. So that's a little strong. But anyway, that's when I started researching Hindu mythology, which interestingly enough, even though my father was very religious, I never really knew the theoretical parts behind religion. So I had to do a lot of research for that. And I just got fascinated. I found that just like this man sort of took care of this building unofficially, Vishnu was the caretaker of the whole universe. So it fit very well into that. When it came time for the second book, even before I wrote the second book, when I met an agent and submitted the manuscript, she said, well, publishers like to know what else you'll be doing. And it suddenly occurred to me that Vishnu is just one part of the Hindu trinity. There's also Shiva, who's the destroyer, Vishnu is the preserver, and there's Brahma, who's the creator. And so I thought, okay, I can write a trilogy. And, I sent it to her. And then I said, well, it took me 5 years to write the first book. What am I getting myself into? I called her up and said, well, don't submit that part about the trilogy. And she said, oh, no, I've already emailed it, and people love it, so you are writing a trilogy. So when I started the second book, there were different things. There was the partition idea, and then there's the Shiva idea. How do you put them together? And since it became a story of this woman in a very male-dominated world, I was able to find this myth of not Shiva, but his spouse, Parvati, who gets so tired of Shiva always going off and meditating that she goes into the woods and creates this little child out of herself. And this boy turns out to be so delightful, she just spends all her time in his company and forgets about her spouse, about Shiva. And so this led me to the culture that you were talking about, the fact that in India there's a very different idea of motherhood, especially the way that women will relate to sons. It's somehow very different. And one of the things I like to point out is some of the art that you see. If you look at a picture of, let's say, Mary and Jesus, there's all this artwork. You'll see that it's very sublime. It's very holy, and everyone is very serene. If you were to look at a picture of Krishna and his mother Yashodhara, you'll see that there's this voluptuousness, and Krishna is a tease, and there's just a lot more physical action between the mother and the son. And so that was a difference that I wanted to bring out. And so that was one of the things that went into the Age of Shiva.
It's fascinating. And so in this third book, how much can you tell us at this point, since you are in the process of the struggle, the journey itself?
It's been very interesting because the third part of the trilogy is really Brahma, who's the creator. The unfortunate thing is that Brahma was elevated to the Trinity because you need a creator for any story. And no one really worships him. I mean, there are only two major temples in all of India for Brahma. And the true third part of the Trinity is really the mother goddess. And she's called the Devi. And so I've really been thinking about that a lot, and I suspect that it's really going to be about her rather than him. But more than that, the trilogy has become a trilogy about India. The first was really a snapshot of the country in contemporary times. And the second book, The Age of Shiva, it traces the evolution of what happened in India, just like this woman is evolving and growing up and maturing, what's happening in India. And now the third one, I really want to push into the future. What might happen tomorrow? Like, here's a scene. It's one of the possibilities. You obviously can't predict the future, but this is one of the things that could happen in the realm of possibility. So that's the way I'm actually working on it.
I find it fascinating in reading your books that while one learns a great deal about other cultures, one can see what is common among human beings. It is amazing to me how you're able to weave into these stories experiences that we could have had here in America in thinking about family and decision-making and choices and consequences. And so you're doing all of this. Everybody's fascinated with your books. At the same time, I can't say enough that you are a professor here at UMBC in mathematics. Why don't you tell the audience about your research, remembering that most people are not mathematicians. So talk, if you will, first about, let's talk about what you've been doing over the past 2 decades, because you are a full professor here.
Yeah, and it's been a great time at UMBC. I joined as an assistant professor, and my field is numerical analysis. And the specific subfield is finite elements. And I think it's enough to say that they're a way of solving very complicated equations that engineers often come up with. If you're building a bridge or something, you don't want it to collapse. And so you have to figure out, if you have a certain load on it, how will the steel bend, and what will be the displacement, the stress, and so on. And so these equations are really, you need a computer to approximate them. And my field actually helps engineers find methods for that approximation. And one of the great things has been that I've been working with an engineer in St. Louis at the University of Washington, and he has a commercial program that engineers use to do these calculations. And so, when he's had a problem or seen something that he can't explain, he's contacted mathematicians, and then we kind of try our little test problems and then figure out what could be going on. And that can sometimes lead to improvements in the algorithm. So some of these things actually find their way into something that's used by actual people. And that kind of shows that I think at UMBC we're all applied mathematicians, which has become very dominant in the field because there's just so much computation that's required in today's world.
As a fellow mathematician, I'm delighted to hear you talking about math in a clear way that the audience can appreciate. Some of us get goosebumps with that kind of talking, and I'm sure the work with the guy at WashU is giving us a chance to show the applications. But the question is, it seems to me, your career at UMBC has been about not just research, but also about teaching. In fact, you had a piece in the New York Times recently about teaching over a 25-year period.
Right.
What have you learned about teaching in general and the teaching and learning process in math, but in general, that might be instructive to others?
I think the main thing is, there's always two conflicting things in teaching, I find. One is, especially in math, there's just so much knowledge that has to be imparted. So how do you present that? And the easiest way is to just present it. Okay, it's just so much. There's all these things that have to be explained. And then the other thing is to keep people's interest. And I think we've been lucky with certainly higher level math courses where you find that people they're motivated enough, that they're into the subject enough, that the interest part is easier to maintain if the math itself is interesting. What I've learned, though, is something outside of UMBC when I've sort of ventured into high schools or middle schools. Yes. And there, the interest part gets much harder to maintain, where you really have to have stuff that is compelling and that will yank people away from whatever they're thinking about and really make them concentrate on what you're doing. And so you weave in all these little experiments or props and so on. And so that's been very interesting, trying to take some of that experience from schools and then use it on some of the earlier, like we have this freshman seminar, first-year seminar, and there you have, people have just come from school, so they still need that kind of motivation. So to use some of those techniques there, and to use it for a general audience. I think you touched upon the fact that it's so hard to see math in the culture.
Yes.
It's so hard for people to really relate to mathematicians. That's become a real focal point for me, trying to push math into the popular culture.
And it's great to see you just talking about left and right brain thinking in different ways. Some of your new work on taming infinity and the mathematics of fiction. Tell us about how a mathematician/novelist can present material to pull people into both sides of thinking about these issues.
Absolutely. The first one, Taming Infinity, this came out of a first-year seminar project that students actually had to do. And the goal was to take something from the curriculum that only a math major would probably see. And this was, the theory behind infinity. And try to present it in a way that anyone could be able to understand if you knew, let's say, fractions,
Sure.
Something very simple.
Sure.
And so using animation and cartoons and so on, I think we'll actually show a little clip from that, which is a sort of trailer that I put together from the presentation.
Great, great.
And the second, what I've been doing recently is something called the mathematics of fiction. And there it's even less math involved. I mean, here I've just, in that one, I've just taken a very basic idea from mathematics. The idea of decomposing things like waves into simpler waves called Fourier series or basis functions, and showing how that same idea translates into many different fields, like anything from animation to imaging, art, to sounds like music, symphonies. I mean, it really pervades everything. And even fiction, even writing fiction, you have that same kind of decomposition. So we'll actually see a little bit of that one too. And both these presentations are available on YouTube or on the UMBC website. So, perhaps some of the viewers will actually see them.
Manil, so many people in our country right now are talking about the need to be as innovative as possible. And the fundamental question is, how do we continue to encourage creativity among our children, our scientists, and Americans in general? Give me some of your thoughts about this relationship between creativity and innovation.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I've noticed just coming from India to here. I mean, India is always touted or held up as this danger or this threat in terms of taking over the world with China.
Sure.
But as someone who grew up there and is familiar with the educational system there, I find that the system here really fosters innovation, questioning, creativity a lot more than the Indian system would, where it's still very much, okay, let's learn this by rote. So just in math itself, you see so many attempts in the last 10, 20 years to really make math accessible for a lot of students. And working in schools and at the university, I have seen that people really have this innovation, this thrust towards creativity. They have it down, I think. What's bothering me though is what you need, what India does very well, and that is a sort of discipline and focus in terms of actually getting into a task, sticking with it, and just forcing yourself to really take the plunge.
Sure.
And because it always takes a while before you start enjoying things.
Yes.
And there seems to be, I think that's where the challenge is more than innovation for this country. Like getting kids to stick with something, getting them into this, pulling them in and then keeping them there. Like retention. I mean,
Sure.
that's really more important than creativity right now. Because I think creativity, we're doing pretty well.
We know how to teach kids to be independent, but to
Right.
help kids become disciplined. Let me ask a couple of final questions. You are obviously well-read. You have been broadly educated. Anybody who reads your books can tell you're rooted in the humanities somehow. Talk about the value of arts and humanities in building the culture and civilization in a society.
Well, interestingly enough, history was always my worst subject. And my mother was a history teacher. Maybe that had something to do with it.
And what do you mean worst subject?
Well, I mean, I got A's in everything, in the school passing exam,
Right.
straight A's in everything.
Yeah.
History, I got a B. and that pulled my aggregate down.
I am so glad that I asked about the definition of worst subject.
Okay.
But continue on.
Okay, but anyway. But the thing is that history in India especially, is thousands of years.
Yes.
And you have to memorize all this stuff, dates and places and kings and so on. And so I always hated all that memorization.
Yes.
And again, it was when I was doing the Age of Shiva that I said, okay, I really need to brush up on the history of India since I'm going to be writing about it. And that's when I started reading a few books, which suddenly seemed to be very different. At least these books were very different from the type of texts we were subjected to in school, where these books really looked at it as a story and really grabbed you and presented these characters like characters out of a novel, like Nehru and Indira Gandhi and so on. So that really brought to me, perhaps more than anything else, this idea that you articulated, the idea that the humanities have such a role to play if they are presented properly, that they can really involve people. For the first time I saw what they say, that, okay, you really have to understand your past to be able to predict your future. And these ideas, I think, I wish that they had been better imparted while I was growing up, because I find that if someone is curious enough, you can still get them when you're an adult. But I think it's very nice if teachers are motivated enough to present this to students. So I'm not an expert on the humanities, but I think it's only after making this journey through the sciences, through math, through tenure and professorship and all that, to this state, that I can really appreciate the thought that you're bringing up.
And to the credit of your mother, the history teacher, and your other teachers, you were given the skills necessary to go back to that work, the reading skills, the thinking skills, and you're doing what we all are doing, and that is continuing to work to learn and grow. Last question. You talked about your development, your parents, the movement from India to Pakistan. It's very interesting thinking about the relationship between one's life and one's history and one's future. What is in the future for Manil Suri, given all that you've been through, given this wonderful 25-year career at UMBC in teaching and research, besides the fact of you're continuing to be a professor at UMBC?
Right.
Tell me what else. What else will come to this writer and mathematician?
Well, right now, I think the thing that's weighing most heavily on my mind is the trilogy. I still have this third part to go.
Sure.
And, after, hopefully it'll be finished, but it's like between a 15 and 20-year project. So that's a large chunk of my life. But after that's done, I really want to write some more. I have this vision of a book that would really explain mathematics to non-mathematicians and still keep them interested. I really would like to do some sort of, big, dramatic kind of mathematical thing, something like, they have this one book project. I'd like that to be a mathematical work where everyone in a city tries to read the same book. Why not choose something that involves math? So that would be very interesting, get the schools involved and so on. And mainly to try and meld these two things together. It's sort of like my own personal unified theory of everything, where trying to pull the math and the fiction together. I think that's something you actually sort of pushed me into, and it's a quest that I think will take some more years, and I'll be interested in seeing what comes out of it.
You've done a great job so far, and the future will be even brighter. We are very proud of you
Thank
here
you.
at UMBC, and it's fun talking to you. Thank you.
Same here. Thank you.